The gunshot cracked across the valley before anyone at the harvest dance even noticed the fiddle had stopped. Nora Ellison felt the floor shake under her boots as men rushed toward the barn doors. Lanterns swung wildly on their hooks, throwing long shadows across the hay bales stacked against the walls. She had been standing beside Wade Calloway only seconds earlier, her hand still warm from his, when the sound tore through the night and every face in the room turned pale. "Stay here," Wade said, his voice suddenly hard, in a way she had not heard from him all evening. She did not stay. She followed him out into the cold, past startled horses pulling at their tethers, toward the corral where a lantern lay shattered on the ground, and a man she did not recognize was pressing a hand to his shoulder, blood slipping between his fingers. "He came at my herd," the rancher next to Wade muttered, breathless. "Caught him cutting the fence wire. Boy panicked and fired before I could stop him." Wade knelt beside the wounded stranger without hesitation, tearing a strip from his own shirt to press against the wound. Nora watched him work with quick, steady hands, the same hands that, only minutes before, had rested lightly on her waist during their dance. She realized then that the man everyone in town warned her about was not cold at all. He was simply a man who had learned, the hard way, never to hesitate. "Get Doc Ferris," Wade said without looking up. "Now." Someone ran for the wagon. Nora crouched down across from him, steadying the injured man's shoulders as Wade worked the makeshift bandage tight. "You didn't have to come out here," Wade said quietly, not taking his eyes off his work. "Neither did you," she answered. "But you did." He looked up at her then, just for a moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, before he turned back to the task at hand. Around them, the dance had emptied out entirely, the music silenced, the barn behind them dark and hollow where an hour ago it had been full of laughter and boots stamping on wooden floorboards. It was strange, Nora thought, how quickly a night could turn. An hour ago she had walked across a crowded room to ask a man to dance, a man every other woman in town had warned her to avoid. Now she knelt in the cold dirt beside him, while a stranger bled between them, and she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that she did not regret a single step she had taken that night. The wagon arrived within minutes, its wheels grinding against the frozen ruts of the road. Doc Ferris, a wiry man with silver hair and quick eyes, jumped down before the horses had even come to a full stop. "Move aside," he said, dropping his bag beside the wounded man. He examined the wound quickly, his fingers working with the ease of long practice. "Clean shot through the muscle. He'll live, if we get that bleeding stopped soon." Wade did not move away. He held the man's shoulders steady, while the doctor worked, murmuring low words of reassurance that Nora could barely hear. She had never seen this side of him before tonight, not the guarded rancher who nodded curtly to people in town and disappeared before anyone could strike up a conversation, but a man who moved toward trouble instead of away from it. "He's stable enough to move," Doc Ferris said, after a long, tense stretch of silence. "Get him into the wagon. I'll finish this at my office." Two men lifted the wounded stranger and carried him toward the wagon. Wade rose to his feet, his shirt sleeve torn and stained, his jaw tight. For a moment he simply stood there, staring out at the dark fields beyond the corral, as though searching for something in the shadows that only he could see. "You did well tonight," Nora said, stepping up beside him. "I did what anyone would do." "No," she said, "not anyone. You didn't hesitate. Most people freeze." He glanced sideways at her, and for the first time that night, something like the beginning of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You didn't freeze either. I don't scare as easy as people think." "No," he said. "I'm starting to see that." The wagon rattled away down the road, carrying the wounded man and the doctor toward town, leaving the two of them standing alone in the cold night air. The dance behind them had scattered into worried clusters of neighbors, murmuring about wire cutters and desperate men, and how close disaster had come to their own herds. But standing there in the dark, Nora found herself thinking, not about the danger that had just passed, but about the hour before it, about the way Wade's hand had felt against hers, about the surprised hush that had fallen over the room when she crossed the floor to ask him for a dance no one expected him to accept. She had heard the warnings for weeks. Since arriving in town to take up her post at the schoolhouse, she had been told by nearly every woman she met that Wade Calloway was not a man to approach. He had lost his wife 2 winters back, they said, and grief had turned him into someone hard and unreachable. He worked his ranch alone, spoke to almost no one unless business required it, and had turned away every attempt at kindness the town had offered him. "He'll bite your head off if you so much as say good morning," one of the other teachers had warned her the very first week. But Nora had watched him from a distance at the general store, at church on Sundays, at the edge of gatherings where he stood apart from the crowd, and she had not seen the coldness everyone described. She had seen a tired man carrying something heavy, the kind of weight that made him careful with his words rather than cruel with them. So when the fiddler struck up a new song, and half the room hesitated to ask him even for the simplest exchange, Nora had crossed the floor herself. "Would you like to dance?" she had asked, holding out her hand before she could think better of it. The silence that followed had been almost comic in its suddenness. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Someone near the punch bowl actually gasped. Wade himself had gone very still, studying her hand for a long moment, as though trying to determine whether this was some kind of joke being played on him. "You don't have to say yes," she had added, when the silence stretched too long. "I only thought someone should ask." Something in his face had shifted then. Not quite a smile, but the loosening of a muscle that had been tense for a very long time. He had taken her hand. They had barely spoken through the first turn of the dance, the room's attention pressing on them from every direction. But by the second turn, Wade had asked her a question about the schoolhouse, and by the third, she had made him laugh. A short, surprised sound, as though laughter itself were unfamiliar to him now. For those few minutes, the guarded rancher everyone described had simply been a man dancing with a woman at a harvest celebration, nothing more complicated than that. Then the gunshot had ended it. Now, standing in the cold beside the empty corral, Nora watched Wade rub a hand across his face, exhaustion and something like relief passing over his features. "Let me walk you back," he said finally. "It's late, and the road isn't safe with whoever else might still be out there." "You should get that shirt looked at too," she said, nodding toward the torn sleeve, the dark stains spreading along the fabric. "Is that your blood or his?" He glanced down, as though he had forgotten the injury entirely. "His, mostly. I caught the fence wire wrong, pulling him clear. It's nothing. Let me see." "Nora, let me see," she repeated, and something in her tone made him stop arguing. He rolled back the torn sleeve to reveal a shallow cut along his forearm, already beginning to darken with dried blood at the edges. It was not serious, but it was not nothing either, and she could see now that he had simply chosen not to mention it while there was a more urgent wound to attend to. "Sit down," she said, nodding toward an overturned crate near the corral fence. "I have a clean handkerchief in my bag, and I know enough from watching Doc Ferris to bind a cut properly." He hesitated only a moment before doing as she asked. She retrieved her bag from where she had left it near the barn, and returned with a folded square of white cloth, kneeling beside him in the dirt, just as she had knelt beside the wounded stranger only minutes before. "You're not afraid of much, are you?" Wade said quietly, watching her work. "I'm afraid of plenty," she said, wrapping the cloth around his forearm with careful, practiced motions. "I just don't let it stop me from doing what needs doing. Most people in this town would have run the other way tonight." "Most people in this town," she said, tying off the bandage, "have never had the chance to see what I saw tonight. A man who moves toward trouble instead of away from it, even when it isn't his own trouble to solve." He was quiet for a long moment, watching her hands still resting against his arm. "You shouldn't have come outside," he said finally. "It could have been dangerous. So could crossing a room to ask a man to dance, apparently," she said, and this time he did smile. A real smile, brief but unmistakable, the kind that changed his whole face. "I suppose it could have been," he admitted. Around them the town was slowly gathering itself back together. Someone had relit the lanterns near the barn doors. A few of the older men stood in a tight circle near the fence line, discussing what should be done about the cut wire and the stranger who had caused all the trouble. Women clustered near the entrance, wrapping shawls tighter against the cold, whispering about how close the danger had come, and how strange it was that Wade Calloway, of all people, had been the one to act first. Nora rose to her feet and offered Wade a hand up, which he took without hesitation this time. Standing close together in the lantern light, neither of them moved to step away. "Thank you," he said, "for the dance. And for this." He nodded toward the bandage on his arm. "It's been a long time since anyone in this town looked at me and saw something other than a man to avoid." "Then this town hasn't been looking closely enough," Nora said simply. They walked back toward the barn together, and though neither of them spoke of it directly, both understood that whatever had begun on the dance floor that night had not ended with the gunshot that interrupted it. If anything, the danger had only made it clearer to Nora that the man beside her was not the cold, unreachable figure the town had painted him to be, and clearer to Wade, perhaps for the first time in 2 long years, that there might be someone in this world willing to stand beside him rather than keep a careful distance. Neither of them could have guessed, walking back through the cold autumn night with the barn lanterns glowing ahead of them, just how much that single dance, and the danger that followed it, would come to change everything that followed. The following morning brought a different kind of tension to the town, quieter but no less consuming. Word of the shooting spread through every household before the sun had fully risen, carried on the tongues of men who had witnessed it and embellished by those who had only heard second-hand accounts. By the time Nora arrived at the schoolhouse, she found the children already buzzing with wild stories about outlaws and gunfights, each version more dramatic than the last. "Is it true a man was shot dead at the dance?" asked one of her older students, a boy named Elias, with wide, eager eyes. "No one died," Nora said firmly, setting her books down on the desk. "A man was injured, and Dr. Ferris is caring for him. That's all anyone needs to know." But even as she said it, she understood that the town's imagination would not be so easily contained. Stories had a way of growing in the telling, and by midday, she suspected half the county would believe Wade Calloway had single-handedly captured a gang of rustlers. The truth, as she understood it from what little Wade had told her the night before, was far simpler and far sadder. The stranger caught cutting the fence wire was not a hardened criminal, but a young drifter named Samuel Cray, who had lost his own family's land 2 seasons back to unpaid debts, and had been moving from ranch to ranch since, taking whatever work or whatever else he could find to survive the winter. He had not meant to steal cattle outright, only to lead a few strays through the cut fence toward a buyer who asked no questions about where livestock came from. When the rancher's shout startled him, his own gun had gone off in panic rather than intent. It was, Nora thought, a story about desperation more than danger, though the town seemed determined to tell it otherwise. At the noon recess, she found herself walking toward the edge of town on an errand for the school, and it was there, near the feed store, that she encountered 2 of the women who had warned her most forcefully against approaching Wade Calloway in the first place. "We heard what happened," said Mrs. Whitfield, a stout woman with sharp eyes and sharper opinions. "Heard you were right there beside him the whole time, in the dirt no less, tending to some stranger's wounds like it was nothing at all." "Someone needed help," Nora said simply. "I was there. I helped." "You could have been hurt," Mrs. Whitfield pressed, "running out into the dark like that, after a gunshot, with a man like Wade Calloway leading the way." "I don't know what you were thinking." "I was thinking that a man was bleeding and needed attention faster than anyone else could provide it," Nora replied, keeping her voice even, despite the irritation building beneath her ribs. "I don't regret it." "You dance with him once, and suddenly you're following him into gunfire," the other woman, a thin, nervous creature named Ruth, added under her breath. "People are talking, Miss Ellison, about the both of you." "Let them talk," Nora said. "I've done nothing I'm ashamed of." She left the 2 women standing near the feed store, their expressions caught somewhere between disapproval and undisguised curiosity, and walked back toward the schoolhouse with her thoughts churning. She had known, of course, that a public dance with Wade Calloway would draw attention. The entire barn had gone silent when she crossed the floor to ask him, after all. But she had not fully anticipated how the events that followed would multiply that attention tenfold, turning what should have been a private, gentle exchange between 2 people into the talk of the entire county. That evening, after the children had gone home and she had finished sweeping the schoolhouse floor, Nora found herself walking the long way home, past the edge of the Calloway property line, though she told herself it was simply a pleasant evening for a longer walk and nothing more. The fields stretched out gold and quiet in the fading light, cattle grazing in loose clusters near the horizon, and in the distance, she could see the modest outline of Wade's ranch house, smoke curling from its single chimney. She did not intend to stop, but as she drew nearer, she saw him, out near the fence line that had been cut the night before, working alone with a coil of new wire and a hammer, repairing the damage himself rather than waiting for hired help. He worked with the same steady, unhurried motion she had seen in him the night before, tending to the wounded stranger's shoulder, and something about the sight of him laboring alone in the quiet evening light made her slow her steps rather than hurry past. He noticed her before she had decided whether to call out. "Miss Ellison," he said, straightening up from his work, wiping his hands against his trousers. "Didn't expect to see you out this way." "I was taking the long way home," she admitted, "though I suppose that's not entirely true. I wanted to see how you were, and whether Samuel Cray's condition had improved." Something flickered across his face at the mention of the young drifter's name. Surprise, perhaps, that she had learned it, or that she cared to ask. "Doc Ferris says he'll heal well enough. Might carry a stiff shoulder for the rest of his days, but he'll live. I sent word to the sheriff, though I'm not certain what will come of it. Cutting fence wire isn't a hanging offense, and the boy was more desperate than dangerous, I think. You don't sound angry with him." Wade shrugged, setting down his hammer. "I've seen hard winters cost men everything they have. Doesn't excuse what he did, cutting my fence and near putting a hole through someone. But I understand the kind of fear that makes a man do foolish things when he's got nothing left to lose." Nora studied him for a long moment, the golden evening light catching the lines of his face, the quiet weariness that seemed to live permanently behind his eyes. "The whole town is talking, you know, about last night. About the dance, the shooting, all of it." "I imagine they are," he said, without much concern in his voice. "Been the talk of this town before, for less interesting reasons than a gunshot and a woman brave enough to ask me to dance. Does it bother you, the talking?" He considered the question seriously, as though it deserved real thought rather than a quick dismissal. "It used to," he admitted finally. "After my wife passed, seemed like every conversation in town went quiet whenever I walked into a room, like they were all waiting to see whether I'd fall apart in front of them. I got tired of being watched like that, easier to keep to myself, work the ranch, let them talk about whatever they wanted without giving them anything new to add to it. And now?" He looked at her directly then, something honest and unguarded passing across his features. "Now I find I don't mind so much what they say, so long as some of what they're saying is true. And last night, the dance at least, that part was true enough." Nora felt warmth rise in her chest at his words, though she kept her expression composed. "I meant what I said last night, about someone needing to ask you. It didn't seem right, watching you stand at the edge of every gathering, like you didn't belong there. Maybe I didn't," he said. "Not for a long while. Grief has a way of putting a man outside of things, even when he's standing right in the middle of a crowded room." "And now?" she asked again, softer this time. He held her gaze a moment longer before answering. "Now I'm not so sure I'm standing outside anymore." The sun continued its slow descent behind the western hills as they stood there together near the mended fence line, and though neither of them spoke of it directly, both understood that something had shifted between them in the space of a single day, something that had begun with an unexpected dance and a gunshot in the dark, and was only now beginning to reveal how deep its roots might grow. "I should get back before it's fully dark," Nora said finally, though she found herself reluctant to end the conversation. "I'll walk with you part way," Wade offered. "Least I can do, given you patched up my arm, and asked after a man half this county would rather see run out of the territory." They walked together along the fence line as the last light faded from the sky, talking easily now of small things, the schoolhouse, the coming winter, the price of cattle feed, as though the careful distance that had defined Wade Calloway's life for 2 long years had quietly, without either of them quite noticing the moment it happened, begun to close. By the time Nora reached the edge of town and bid him good night, she understood with a certainty that surprised her just how much one dance and one desperate gunshot in the dark had already begun to change the shape of both their lives, and she suspected, with something between hope and quiet fear, that the changes to come would only grow larger from here. Word of Samuel Cray's recovery reached the schoolhouse 3 days later, carried by one of the older boys whose father had spoken with the sheriff directly. The young drifter would face no charges, it seemed, on account of Wade's own testimony that the shooting had been an accident, born of panic rather than malice. and that the fence wire could be mended for the cost of a few hours' labor. What could not be so easily mended, however, was the shift that had settled over the town's opinion of Wade Calloway himself. Nora noticed it first in small ways. The butcher, who had always given Wade a curt nod and nothing more, now lingered a moment longer to ask after his herd. The Reverend's wife, passing him on the street, offered a genuine smile instead of the polite, careful distance she usually kept. It seemed the danger of that night, and the manner in which Wade had met it without hesitation, had cracked something open in the town's collective judgment of him. A judgment that had calcified over 2 years of grief no one quite knew how to approach. But not everyone's opinion had softened, and Nora found this out clearly enough on a Sunday afternoon when Mrs. Whitfield cornered her outside the church with an expression that suggested she had been waiting for the opportunity all week. "I'll say this plainly, Miss Ellison, because I think plain speaking serves you better than pretty words," the older woman began. "You're a school teacher in this town, responsible for shaping the minds of half our children. Your reputation matters, whether you like the sound of that or not. And a woman seen walking the fence line of a widower's ranch at sundown, alone, unaccompanied. That's the kind of thing that gets talked about in ways you might not enjoy hearing. I wasn't aware walking home required an escort," Nora said, keeping her tone even, despite the flush of irritation rising in her chest. "It's not the walking that concerns anyone. It's whose land you were walking near, and how long you lingered there," Mrs. Whitfield pressed. "Wade Calloway is not a bad man, I'll grant you that much, after what happened at the dance. But he is a grieving man, and grieving men do strange things when a woman shows them kindness. You could be setting yourself up for heartbreak, dear, following a path that isn't yours to walk." Nora considered her words carefully before responding, unwilling to let anger dictate her reply. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Whitfield, truly, but I've made my own decisions for a good many years now, and I intend to keep making them. If walking near a fence line at sundown is the worst scandal this town can conjure about me, I think I'll survive it well enough." The older woman's mouth tightened, but she said nothing further, only turned and walked back toward the churchyard with the stiff posture of someone who believed she had been dismissed rather than answered. Nora did not mention the conversation to anyone, not even to the other teachers she shared meals with most evenings, though she found herself turning the older woman's warning over in her mind more than she cared to admit. It was true that she barely knew Wade Calloway, a handful of conversations, one dance, one shared evening tending to a wounded stranger and a mended fence. And yet something about him had settled into her thoughts in a way few things had before, a quiet insistence that refused to be reasoned away by warnings about reputation or propriety. She saw him again the following Tuesday, quite by accident, at the general store where she had gone to purchase chalk and ink for the schoolhouse. He stood near the counter with a list in hand, looking somewhat out of place among the shelves of ribbon and thread that made up half the store's inventory, clearly a man more accustomed to hardware and feed than the finer domestic goods. "Miss Ellison," he said, straightening when he noticed her. "Didn't expect to see you here on a weekday." "The children go through chalk faster than I can keep the schoolhouse stocked," she said, smiling despite herself at his evident discomfort among the ribbons. "You look like a man who's wandered somewhere unfamiliar." "My housekeeper usually handles these errands," he admitted. "She's been under the weather this week, so the task fell to me. I confess, I have no idea what half of what's on this list is meant to be used for." Nora glanced at the paper in his hand and could not help the small laugh that escaped her. "That's embroidery thread, Mr. Calloway. Unless you've taken up needlework, I suspect your housekeeper wanted something else entirely, and simply wrote down whatever she could remember from the last time she visited." "I'll take your word for it," he said, and there was that same brief, surprised smile she had seen at the fence line, the one that seemed to catch him off guard each time it appeared. "Would you mind terribly helping me sort through the rest of this? I'd hate to bring home a basket full of the wrong supplies and have to make this trip twice." She agreed, and they spent the better part of 20 minutes moving through the store together, Nora identifying items on the list while Wade gathered them into a basket, the shopkeeper watching the two of them with poorly disguised curiosity from behind the counter. It was, Nora thought, a wonderfully ordinary sort of afternoon, nothing dramatic, nothing that would give Mrs. Whitfield further cause for concern, simply two people helping each other through a small task, and yet she found herself more at ease in his company than she had felt with almost anyone else in this town since her arrival. I heard the whole county's talking about the dance, Wade said, as they walked toward the counter to pay, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. And about the shooting after. I hope it hasn't caused you any trouble at the schoolhouse. Nothing I can't manage, she said, though I confess, a few of the town's women have taken it upon themselves to worry about my reputation on my behalf. I'm sorry for that, he said, and he sounded genuinely regretful. It isn't fair, the way this town watches a person and decides what their life ought to look like. I learned that the hard way these past 2 years. You needn't apologize, she said. I chose to cross that dance floor. I chose to follow you outside when the shooting started. Those were my decisions, and I don't regret them, regardless of what anyone else thinks they ought to mean. He studied her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded passing behind his eyes. Not many people in this town speak so plainly, he said. I find I like it. Then perhaps you should spend more time around people who speak plainly, she said, instead of avoiding every gathering where someone might ask you a direct question. Is that an invitation, Miss Ellison? It might be, she said, and found herself smiling as she said it. They paid for the supplies and stepped out onto the street together, the autumn afternoon bright and cool around them, the town moving through its ordinary business, wagons rattling past, children chasing each other along the boardwalk, neighbors exchanging greetings outside the post office. Wade offered to carry her chalk and ink alongside his own basket of supplies, and she let him, the two of them walking together toward the schoolhouse in no particular hurry. My housekeeper mentioned there's a supper gathering at the church next Sunday, Wade said as they walked, his tone carefully casual, in a way that suggested the casualness had taken some effort to arrange. For the harvest offering, I hadn't intended to go, but I find myself reconsidering. Reconsidering because of the supper, or because of who might be attending it. Both, I suppose, he admitted, though mostly the latter. Nora felt her pulse quicken slightly at the implication, though she kept her expression composed. I'll be there, she said simply. The other teachers and I always help organize the tables. Then perhaps I'll see you there. Perhaps you will. They reached the schoolhouse steps, and Wade set down her supplies carefully on the topmost step, rather than handing them to her directly, as though reluctant to end the conversation by completing the small errand that had brought them together. Thank you for your help in the store, he said, and for not laughing too hard at my confusion over embroidery thread. I make no promises about future purchases, she said, and he laughed. A real laugh this time, unguarded and warm, the kind of sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it delighted her to hear it. Good day, Miss Ellison. Good day, Mr. Calloway. She watched him walk back down the street toward his wagon, his basket of supplies balanced against one hip, and found herself lingering on the schoolhouse steps longer than the errand required, turning over the small, ordinary exchange in her mind, as though it held more weight than its simple contents suggested. It was not until she had gathered her supplies and stepped inside the empty schoolhouse that she allowed herself to fully acknowledge what she had been feeling for days now, ever since that first dance, a warmth that had nothing to do with propriety or reputation or the careful judgments of women like Mrs. Whitfield, and everything to do with the quiet, steady presence of a man the whole town had once warned her to avoid, and whom she now found herself thinking of more often than she cared to admit. The following days passed in a rhythm that felt, to Nora, both entirely ordinary and quietly extraordinary, all at once. She taught her lessons each morning, the children's voices filling the small schoolhouse with recitations of arithmetic and reading, and each afternoon, she found some small reason to walk the longer path home, past the edge of the Calloway property, though she never lingered long enough to draw further comment from the town's watchful eyes. She saw Wade twice more that week, once at the edge of his property, mending a section of fence that had nothing to do with the earlier damage, and once outside the sheriff's office, where he had gone to inquire after Samuel Cray's continued recovery, and had arranged, she later learned, to offer the young drifter temporary work on his ranch, rather than see him turned out into the cold winter with nothing. It seemed the decent thing to do, Wade explained simply, when she asked him about it. The boy made a foolish mistake, but he's not without skill, and I could use an extra pair of hands before the winter sets in fully. Better that than see him wander from ranch to ranch until his luck runs out entirely. It was, Nora thought, exactly the kind of quiet generosity the town had failed to see in him these past 2 years, Hidden beneath the guarded silence, grief had wrapped around him like a heavy coat. She found herself wondering how many other kindnesses he had performed without anyone noticing, simply because no one had thought to look past the reputation that preceded him. Sunday arrived clear and cold, the kind of crisp autumn day that made the whole valley seem to glow beneath a pale, high sun. The church supper drew nearly the entire town, long tables set up beneath the old oak trees behind the building, laden with dishes each family had contributed toward the harvest offering. Nora arrived early with the other teachers to help arrange the tables, and it was there, amid the bustle of preparation, that she first spotted Wade's wagon pulling up along the road. He looked different somehow, dressed in a clean shirt rather than his usual work clothes, his hair combed back neatly, though the careful, guarded posture he carried into most gatherings remained. Nora watched him hesitate near the edge of the churchyard, clearly uncertain of his welcome, before Samuel Cray, walking with a slight stiffness in his bandaged shoulder but otherwise recovered, climbed down from the wagon beside him, and the two of them made their way toward the gathering together. It was a small thing, Nora thought, watching them approach, but it spoke volumes about the man Wade Calloway truly was, beneath the reputation the town had built around him. A man who took in a stranger who had wronged him, and treated him, instead, with quiet dignity rather than scorn. "Mr. Calloway," she said, moving to greet him as he reached the edge of the tables. "I'm glad you came." "I nearly didn't," he admitted, his eyes flickering briefly toward the assembled crowd, many of whom had turned to watch his arrival with open curiosity. "But I find myself less concerned with what this town thinks of me than I once was. And what changed that?" He looked at her directly, something warm and certain in his expression that had not been there during their first dance weeks before. "You did," he said simply. "Or perhaps I should say, you reminded me that I had a choice in the matter, that I could keep standing at the edge of every gathering, waiting to be judged, or I could simply walk into the middle of it and let people see whatever they were going to see regardless." Nora felt her chest warm at his words, though she kept her voice light. "Well, since you've made the effort to walk into the middle of it, I suppose the least I can do is make certain you have a proper seat at the table." She led him and Samuel toward one of the long benches, introducing the young drifter to a few of the other teachers, with a warmth that put the boy visibly at ease, his earlier nervousness melting into something closer to gratitude, as the gathering slowly, gradually, folded him into its ordinary rhythm, rather than casting him out as the stranger who had caused so much trouble weeks before. Throughout the afternoon, Nora found her attention returning again and again to Wade, watching as the careful distance he had maintained from the town for 2 long years began, slowly, to soften. He spoke with the Reverend about the coming winter's harvest. He accepted a plate of pie from one of the older women, with genuine thanks, rather than his usual curt nod. He even laughed, once, at some joke one of the ranch hands made about cattle prices, a full, easy laugh that drew more than a few surprised glances from the townsfolk, who had never heard such a sound from him before. It was near the end of the afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent toward the western hills and families began gathering their empty dishes to head home, that Wade found a quiet moment to draw Nora aside, away from the bustle of departing wagons and children chasing each other across the churchyard grass. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice low and careful, as though the words required more courage than she might have guessed. "For today, for the dance weeks ago, for all of it, really. I don't think I would have found my way back into this town's company without you pushing me toward it." "You did the pushing yourself," Nora said. "I only opened the door." "Perhaps," he said, "but I don't think I would have walked through it without knowing you were on the other side." The words hung between them, in the cooling autumn air, simple and honest, carrying a weight that neither of them rushed to fill with further speech. Around them, the churchyard slowly emptied, families climbing into wagons, children waving goodbye to friends, the ordinary business of a small town closing out its Sunday gathering, and in the midst of it, Nora understood, with a certainty that settled warmly into her chest, that whatever had begun with a single dance weeks before had not only survived the town's watchful judgment and the danger of that first violent night, but had grown into something neither of them could easily turn away from now, even if they had wanted to. Autumn deepened into the first hard frosts of the season, and with the changing weather came a changing rhythm to the growing friendship between Nora and Wade. What had begun as chance meetings in town became something more deliberate, though neither of them spoke openly of courtship. Wade began attending the small gatherings he had avoided for 2 years: barn raisings, church socials, the occasional evening of cards at the Hendersons' place, and each time, Nora found herself watching him ease a little further into the life of the town he had shut himself away from. It was on a cold Thursday afternoon, when the schoolhouse let out early, on account of an approaching storm, that Wade first invited her to see the ranch properly, rather than simply passing its edges on her walks home. "There's a delivery of feed coming for the winter stores," he explained, as though the invitation required some practical justification beyond simple company, and Samuel could use a hand keeping the books straight. The boy's clever with animals, but hopeless with numbers. "I thought, since you teach arithmetic to children twice his age with such patience, you might not mind lending a hand for an hour." Nora recognized the invitation for what it was, an excuse, gently offered, to bring her fully into the world he had kept so carefully closed off, and she accepted without hesitation. The ranch house itself surprised her when she first stepped inside. She had expected, perhaps, the bare, neglected dwelling of a man who had spent 2 years avoiding his own life, but instead, she found a home that was simply quiet rather than abandoned. Clean, orderly, though sparse in the way of a house where joy had not been invited in for some time. A woman's touches remained here and there, faded now with age. A set of curtains stitched with careful, old-fashioned patterns, a small collection of pressed flowers framed above the mantel, evidence of a life that had once been fuller than the one Wade now lived alone. "My wife's handiwork," Wade said quietly, following her gaze to the curtains. "Margaret, she had a gift for such things. I never could bring myself to replace them, though I suppose most men would have by now. I think it's a fine thing, keeping a piece of someone you loved close to you," Nora said gently. "There's no need to apologize for it." He was quiet for a long moment, studying the curtains as though seeing them freshly through her eyes, rather than his own long familiarity with them. "She died in the winter, 2 years back this coming season," he said finally. "A fever that came on sudden and never let go, despite everything Doc Ferris tried. We'd been married 6 years. Never had children, though we'd hoped to, before the end." "I'm sorry," Nora said softly. "That must have been an unbearable loss." "It was," he admitted. "For a long while, I didn't think I'd find my way back to anything resembling an ordinary life. Seemed easier to just keep working the ranch, keep my head down, let the seasons pass, without expecting much from any of them. I told myself that was enough, that grief and work together made a kind of life a man could live out his days in, even if it wasn't much of one. And now?" He turned to look at her, something raw and honest in his expression that she had not seen from him before, not even during their quietest moments together. "Now I find myself wanting more than that, wanting it in a way that frightens me a little, if I'm honest, because I remember how much it costs to lose something you've let yourself care about that deeply." Nora crossed the small distance between them, reaching out to take his hand in both of hers. "Loving someone doesn't guarantee losing them, Wade. And even when it does end that way eventually, as it does for all of us in time, the love itself isn't wasted for having been given." "That's a generous way of looking at grief," he said, his voice rough. "It's the only way I know how to look at it," she said. "My own mother passed when I was young, and my father grieved her for years afterward in silence, much as you've done. I watched him waste so much of the life he had left, afraid to let anyone close again for fear of losing them too. I don't want that for you, and I don't think you want it for yourself either. Not really. Not if you're honest about what you're feeling right now." Wade was silent for a long moment, his hand still held between hers, before he finally spoke. "I haven't let myself want anything this much in 2 years. It terrifies me more than I can properly explain." "Then let it terrify you," Nora said gently, "and want it anyway." Outside, the first flakes of the coming storm began drifting past the windows, and inside the quiet ranch house, something between them shifted fully into the open. No longer a question left carefully unspoken, but an understanding both of them now recognized, and, for the first time, neither of them shied away from acknowledging. They did not speak of marriage that afternoon, nor even of courtship in any formal sense, but something had changed between them all the same, settling into place with the quiet certainty of a decision already made, even if the words to name it had not yet been spoken aloud. The weeks that followed carried them through the first true snows of winter, and with the change in weather came a change in how openly the town regarded their growing closeness. What had once been the subject of hushed gossip near the feed store slowly transformed into something closer to gentle acceptance. Even Mrs. Whitfield, who had cornered Nora after church weeks before with her warnings about reputation, found herself, on one particularly cold Sunday, remarking to Nora, with something almost like approval, that Wade Calloway had not looked so at ease in company since before his wife's passing. But acceptance, Nora would soon learn, was not universal, and the obstacle that arose came from a direction she had not anticipated. It began with a letter delivered to the schoolhouse in early December, addressed to the members of the town's school board rather than to Nora directly, though word of its contents reached her within a day of its arrival. The letter, penned by a distant cousin of Wade's late wife, who had taken it upon herself to correspond regularly with acquaintances still living in the county, expressed grave concern that the town's schoolteacher had been seen keeping company with a grieving widower in a manner the cousin considered unseemly, and suggested, none too subtly, that a woman of such loose judgment might not be a suitable influence over the town's children. The school board, cautious by nature and unwilling to risk scandal, called Nora in for a private conversation the following week. "We don't doubt your abilities as a teacher, Miss Ellison," the board's chairman said carefully, an older man named Harold Denby, who had always treated her with courtesy before this meeting. "But a teacher's reputation reflects on the school itself and on this town. We've received concerns, not unfounded ones, perhaps, about the nature of your relationship with Mr. Calloway." "My relationship with Mr. Calloway is my own affair," Nora said, keeping her voice steady despite the anger rising in her chest. "It has never once interfered with my duties at this school, nor will it." "That may be so," Denby said, "but perception matters as much as truth, in matters such as this. We would ask that you exercise greater discretion going forward, for the sake of your position here." Nora left the meeting with her composure intact, though her hands trembled slightly once she was alone in the empty schoolhouse, turning over the unfairness of the demand in her mind. She had built her position in this town through years of careful, honest work, and now found it threatened not by any failing of her own, but by the small-minded gossip of a woman who had never even met her. She told Wade of the meeting that evening, finding him at the edge of his property mending a fence despite the bitter cold, and watched his expression darken with a fury she had not seen from him before. "This is my fault," he said. "If I'd kept my distance, as the town expected me to, none of this would have touched you." "Don't you dare say that," Nora said sharply. "I made my own choices, same as I told Mrs. Whitfield weeks ago. I won't have you taking the blame for a decision that was mine to make." "But it's costing you something you worked hard to build," he said. "Your position, your reputation in this town. I won't let that be the price of my company." "And what would you have me do instead?" she asked. "Walk away from you to satisfy people who've never once tried to understand either of us?" Wade was silent for a long moment, the cold wind cutting between them, before he finally spoke, his voice low and uncertain in a way she had rarely heard from him. "I don't know," he admitted. "I only know I won't be the reason you lose something you've worked so hard for." It was, Nora realized with a sinking feeling in her chest, the first real doubt she had seen cross his face since that first dance weeks before. Not doubt about his feelings for her, but doubt about whether those feelings were worth the cost they seemed poised to extract from her life. And she understood, standing there in the bitter cold with the fence half mended between them, that the coming days would require more courage from both of them than either had yet been asked to show. For several days after the meeting with the school board, Nora found herself withdrawing slightly, not from Wade himself, but from the easy openness they had built between them over the preceding weeks. She told herself it was caution, a reasonable response to the pressure now bearing down on her position at the schoolhouse, but she recognized, in her more honest moments, that it was closer to fear. Fear that continuing forward with Wade might indeed cost her everything she had built in this town, and fear, too, that she was not brave enough to pay that price. Wade noticed the distance immediately, though he did not press her about it, and this restraint, more than anything, reminded her of the man she had first seen at the harvest dance, patient, careful, unwilling to demand more from someone than they were ready to give. But she could see, in the quiet way he watched her during the rare moments they still crossed paths in town, that her withdrawal cost him more than he let on. It was Samuel Cray, of all people, who finally forced the matter into the open. The young drifter, now fully recovered and settled into steady work on Wade's ranch, sought Nora out one afternoon as she walked home from the schoolhouse, catching up to her along the frozen road with an urgency that suggested he had been waiting for the opportunity. "Miss Ellison," he said, a little breathless from hurrying to catch her. "Might I speak plainly with you? I don't mean to overstep, but I've watched Mr. Calloway close these past weeks, and I think you ought to know something." "Go on," Nora said, curious despite herself. "Before you came to this town, before that dance, Mr. Calloway was hardly a man at all, if you'll forgive me saying so," Samuel said. "He worked from before sunrise to well past dark, ate his meals alone, spoke to no one he didn't have to. I've only known him these few weeks since the shooting, but even I can see the difference in him now. He laughs. He asks after people. He looks forward to things, the way a man ought to." Samuel paused, his young face earnest in the cold afternoon light. "I know it isn't my place to say so, but I'd hate to see him go back to being that shadow of a man again, just because this town can't mind its own business. And I think you'd hate it too, if you let yourself admit it." Nora felt the boy's words settle into her chest with the weight of truth she had been avoiding. "It isn't so simple, Samuel. My position at the schoolhouse, with respect, Miss Ellison, seems to me, a position's only worth keeping if it doesn't cost you the parts of your life that actually make you happy," Samuel said, with the blunt honesty of youth that had not yet learned to soften difficult truths. "Mr. Calloway gave me work and a roof when I'd wronged him, and had no right to expect either. Seems the least I can do is tell you plainly what I see, even if it isn't my business to say it." He left her standing on the frozen road, with his words echoing in her mind, and Nora walked the rest of the way home in a thoughtful silence, turning over the shape of her own fear and what it had nearly cost her. That evening, she made her decision. She found Wade in his barn, tending to the horses by lantern light, his breath fogging in the cold air as he worked. He looked up when she entered, surprise and something like cautious hope crossing his face. "Nora," he said. "I didn't expect. I've been foolish these past few days," she said, before he could finish. "I let fear make my decisions for me, and I'm sorry for the distance I put between us. Samuel said something to me today that I should have understood on my own, weeks ago." "What did he say?" "That a position isn't worth keeping if it costs you the parts of your life that make you happy," she said. "And he's right. I won't let this town's narrow judgment decide who I'm allowed to care for, Wade. I'd rather lose the schoolhouse than lose what we've built these past months." Wade set down the brush he had been using on the horse's coat, crossing the barn to stand before her, his expression open in a way she had not seen even during their most honest conversations. "I won't ask you to make that choice," he said. "I meant what I said before. I won't be the reason you lose something you've worked so hard for." "Then don't ask me to," Nora said. "Let me choose it for myself. I'm choosing you, Wade, whatever that costs." For a long moment, he simply looked at her, something fierce and grateful passing behind his eyes, before he closed the remaining distance between them and kissed her, gently at first, then with a certainty that spoke of 2 years of loneliness, finally finding its answer. The resolution came, in the end, not through grand confrontation, but through quiet persistence. Nora returned to the school board the following week and stated, plainly and without apology, that her personal life was her own affair, and that if the board found her teaching wanting, they were welcome to say so directly, rather than hiding behind the gossip of a stranger's letter. Harold Denby, to his credit, seemed almost relieved by her directness, and after a brief, awkward silence, admitted that no one on the board had any genuine complaint about her work, only discomfort with the talk it had stirred up. The matter, in the end, was allowed to quietly settle, as most small-town scandals eventually do when met with calm, unashamed honesty rather than retreat. The true resolution, however, came a month later, at the town's winter gathering, held in the very same barn where the harvest dance had taken place months before. The barn had been decorated with pine boughs and lanterns strung along the rafters, and the whole town turned out, despite the bitter cold, eager for an evening of warmth and music before the deepest part of winter set in. Wade arrived early this time, no longer lingering at the edges of the gathering as he once had, but moving through the crowd with an ease that surprised even those who had watched his transformation these past months. Samuel Cray stood nearby, laughing with a group of ranch hands his own age, fully welcomed now into the ordinary rhythm of the town's life. And near the center of the barn, beside the makeshift stage where the fiddler tuned his instrument, Nora waited. When the music began, Wade did not hesitate this time, nor did he wait for her to cross the floor toward him. He walked to her directly, in full view of the entire gathering, and held out his hand. "Would you dance with me, Miss Ellison?" "I thought you'd never ask, Mr. Calloway," she said, smiling as she took his hand. They danced together as the whole barn watched, no gunshot this time to interrupt the moment. No danger lurking beyond the doors. Only the warm glow of lantern light, the easy sound of the fiddle, and the quiet, certain understanding between two people who had found, against every expectation the town had once held, something worth building a life around. Later, as the dance wound down and the crowd began to thin, Wade drew her aside, near the same corral where they had once knelt together over a wounded stranger, and reached into his coat pocket to produce a small, simple ring that had belonged, she would later learn, to his own mother. "I know it's only been a few months," he said, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability plain in his eyes. "And I know this town will talk, regardless of what I say tonight. But I've spent 2 years believing I was meant to live out my days alone, grieving what I'd lost, and expecting nothing more from the years ahead of me. You changed that the moment you crossed that dance floor, and asked a question no one else in this town had the courage to ask. I don't want to spend another winter without you beside me, Nora. Will you marry me?" Nora felt tears rise unbidden as she looked at him. This man the whole town had once warned her to avoid, who had turned out to be gentler and braver than anyone had given him credit for. "Yes," she said simply, "I will." The town's opinion of Wade Calloway, once fixed so firmly on the image of a cold, unreachable widower, shifted permanently after that winter. Not because of any single dramatic event, but because enough small moments had accumulated, one after another, into an undeniable truth the whole county eventually came to accept: that grief need not be a life sentence, and that sometimes it takes only one person brave enough to ask a simple question to change the entire course of another person's future. Years later, when their own children asked how their parents had first met, Nora would tell them the story simply, without embellishment, that their father had once been a man everyone in town was afraid to approach, and that she had walked across a crowded dance floor anyway, because she had seen something in him worth reaching for. And their father, listening nearby with the same quiet smile that had first surprised her so many winters before, would always add the same simple truth to the end of her telling. One dance, he would say, had changed everything.